Hello people, this actually is my first wooden model and I spent pretty much time choosing it, and finally I came to this, a small yawl. Box contains pre-cut parts to build the jig, main structure, walnut veneer parts for board planking and few metal parts. Also bills of materials, text manual, scheme of parts sheets and color photo manual. I use a sharp hobby knife to remove parts from sheets and small files and sandpaper to flush with. Be careful with this, especially with files. Parts are very thin and could be easily damaged or broken. Fortunately, it's also easy to fix such mistakes with a bit of glue. Next, I assemble the main plate of the jig and make a bevel on two keel parts and the jig's fake ribs. Bevel is marked on parts with a laser line. I call these ribs fake because it's a base for yawl actual ribs and it will be removed later. So I remove excess material with a hobby knife and file. Then I glue fake ribs to the jig with PVA, also known as white glue. Again, all parts are very fragile, but all damage could be easily fixed. At the same time I assemble a keel with its stem, rear rib and front parts. And finally glue the keel section to the jig. Here I made a mistake with riser ring installation. I think it's called riser ring, not sure. Holes and risers don't match with jig's fake ribs. I fix it using the engraver and finally glue the stern to the jig. Now it's time to glue actual ribs. It's made from very thin walnut veneer. It's about 0.6 mm thick and it's extremely fragile. I keep these planks into hot water for a few minutes before bending and gluing. First time I tried to use PVA glue, but there was almost no space for clamps, so I decided to use super glue instead. First I pass the plank through the hole in the riser, then apply glue and press the plank to the jig's rib. I think here I made a mistake. These planks should be glued only to the keel and upper parts of the jig ribs. Later this mistake will lead me to problems with removing the jig. After all front ribs are glued, I remove all excesses with hobby cutters and clear ribs from glue with sandpaper. Don't throw out the planks, you can still use them later. Other ribs are made with the same method. Now let's move to the planking. As with the ribs, I hold planks in hot water and then bend them with fingers and glue to the ribs and the neighbor plank with super glue. It's need to be pressed to the ribs and to previous plank, which was challenging. It was almost unreal to use clamps because planks are thin and fragile. After this I remove all excess planks with a hobby knife and sandpaper to make the hull flat with the stern. After this I polish the hull with sandpaper to make it smooth. Glue patches to the places where I decided that holes between the planks were too large and polish it again. And finally it's time to remove the jig. I cut all parts that were higher than the riser, and on this step, according to the manual, the jig should be easily removed. But something went wrong. As I mentioned before, I suppose that I used too much glue and it became too hard to remove the jig. I decided to use an engraver to remove the front part of the jig. After this I was able to dismount the jig from the hull. Next step is to glue the deck and the locker parts. I use PVA glue and small hobby clamps for this. Somewhere here I realized that I missed making all the ribs. So I made it with the same method as before and removed all that exceeds the risers. After all ribs are in their place, I glue the banks and rest of the deck parts. Hold the inner plank in hot water, bend it and glue with CA glue. Glue plank to the stern, glue fender with PVA to hold it in place with rubber bands and clips. I made a rudder with wooden planks and brass parts from the kit using super glue. Polish upper part of the hull, glue upper plank and row locks. And that's it, here is the finished model. And finally, is this model good as the first wooden model for the beginners? Generally, the most important thing for the first model is to actually finish the model, and I was able to finish this yawl in about 2 weeks. And yes, as I mentioned before, this is my first model. There are still a lot of imperfections and mistakes, but finally it's a finished bot. Generally it requires only a few basic tools to make it, but if you make the same mistake with the glue, which honestly speaking is easy, it will be really hard to remove the jig, and an engraver it's not the cheapest tool for beginners. You will get the basic skills while working with this board and a general understanding of what scale models are. And for 25 to 30 United States dollars on eBay, it's a very cheap model. But I will highly recommend finding a model on a bigger scale if it will cost you more. I hope this video will help someone to start with this amazing hobby. Thanks for watching, and remember that there are no uncorrectable mistakes.